Learn Japanese history.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into, well, a really crucial time in really Japanese history.
Yeah, we're tracing things from roughly the 3rd century up to the 6th. It's this period where Japan really starts to transform.
Right, moving from what we know about the Yamatai kingdom towards the beginnings of a more unified political power, the Yamato polity.
Exactly. And it's a fascinating period because, there aren't tons of detailed written records from Japan itself for these early centuries.
So how do we know what was happening?
Well, we rely a lot on accounts from China, which kept pretty good records, and also archaeology, especially these amazing burial mounds that start appearing.
Okay, let's start there then. What do we know about what happened right after Queen Himiko of Yamatai? She's pretty famous.
She is. The Chinese records mention that after she died, there was a bit of chaos. A male ruler tried to take over, but it didn't stick.
Unrest, yeah.
Right. Things only seemed to calm down when another queen, a young woman named Io, took the throne.
And there's still that big question about Yamatai itself. Where was it?
Oh, definitely. That debate is still ongoing. The main theories are Kyushu, or the Yamato region, near modern Nara.
And the archaeology gives clues.
It does. If you lean towards Kyushu, you find lots of bronze weapons like halberds and also bronze mirrors concentrated there. That suggests a kind of power base,
Okay. And the Yamato theory.
Well, if Yamatai was in the Yamato area, then you look at the distribution of bronze bells, the Tutaku. They're more concentrated further east in western Japan.
So different artifacts, different regions, maybe different power centers back then?
That's the idea. It hints that before things got more unified later, the political landscape might have been, more fragmented. Different groups with different symbols of status.
Okay, so then things start to change quite dramatically, right? Around the late 3rd century.
Yeah, just as Yamatai sort of fades from the Chinese records, something new and very visible pops up in Japan, these huge burial mounds.
The Kofun.
Exactly. And this is a really significant shift. Before this, in the Yayoi period, you had more communal burial sites.
Right, shared cemeteries.
But these Kofun, they were for individuals, very important individuals, judging by the scale. It really signals the rise of powerful leaders.
And that's why we call this whole era the Kofun period.
Pretty much. From the late 3rd century, maybe early 4th, all the way up to the 7th century, it's defined by these mounds.
So what did the early ones look like, say from the 4th century? The Zenki Kofun.
The early ones often have this very distinctive shape. You've probably seen pictures. It's like a keyhole.
The keyhole shape, right? Zempa Kofun.
That's the one. Zenpa Kofun, square front, round back. Very unique to Japan at this time. We're not entirely sure why that specific shape, but it was clearly important.
And where did they build them?
Often in really strategic spots, on hills, overlooking settlements, overlooking the rice paddies. They really used the landscape.
Making a statement, probably.
Definitely. And the construction itself, they covered the mounds with stones, fukiishi, and along the edges, especially on top, they placed these ceramic cylinders.
The Haniwa.
The haniwa, yeah. Early on, mostly simple cylinders, maybe some jars. Later, they get more elaborate.
And inside, what were the burials like?
The burial chambers in these early ones were usually vertical pits lined with stone slabs, like a stone coffin sunk into the mound, sometimes just clay around the body.
And grave goods. What did they put in with the rulers?
Ritual items, mostly. Bronze mirrors, which were probably symbolic, kama-shaped jewels called magatama, and swords, things associated with status and perhaps religious authority.
So mirrors, jewels, swords. It suggests the rulers had a kind of priestly role.
That's one interpretation, yeah. Especially for the early phase. The scale, the location, the grave goods, it all points to the emergence of powerful new rulers, and the heartland seems to be the Yamato region.
And you mentioned this keyhole shape spreading out.
Yes, and that's really key. You start finding these standardized keyhole tombs in other regions outside Yamato.
What does that tell us?
It strongly suggests that local leaders in those areas were being incorporated into a larger political structure, a hierarchy centered on Yamato. Adopting the tomb style was like buying into the system. Shows Yamato's influence spreading.
Okay, so this emerging power, we're calling it the Yamato polity. You mentioned we should be careful with terms like Yamato court.
Right. Historians now tend to prefer Yamato polity, Yamato seiken, rather than the older Yamato court, Yamato chostai, especially for this early period.
Why the change? What's the thinking?
Well, a couple of reasons. First, the actual name Yamato for the whole state really only gets formalized much later, like with the Yersh Code in the 8th century.
Ah, okay. So they weren't calling themselves Yamato in that official sense yet.
Probably not in the same way.
Huh.
And also, the early center of power, it didn't even cover the whole Yamato province geographically. It was more localized initially.
So not a fully fledged court with a bureaucracy and everything.
Not yet. Think of it more as a political league or an alliance centered on the most powerful family, the one led by the Kimi, the great king.
Yeah.
It was powerful, yes, but different from the later, more structured imperial court. More like a network of power.
That clarifies things. So moving forward into the mid-Kofun period, say late 4th, 5th centuries, what changes?
We see a big increase in the number of Kofun, and they spread even wider, all the way from southern Tohoku down to southern Kyushu.
Wow, that's a huge area.
It really is. It shows the Yamato influence consolidating and expanding significantly during the 5th century.
Are there some famous examples from this period? Really massive ones?
Oh, absolutely. This is the era of the truly gigantic Kofun, like the Gobijama Kofun, which is thought to be Emperor Jin's tomb.
Okay.
And even bigger, the Daisenri Kofun in Sakai, near Osaka, believed to be Emperor Nintoku's tomb. It's one of the largest tombs in the world by area.
Immense. And you mentioned they started having moats.
Yes, these huge Kofun often have these wide moats around them, sometimes multiple moats.
Does that mean more warfare?
Depends. It could partly be about status and grandeur, marking off the sacred space, maybe some defense aspect, but we also see changes inside the tombs.
Like what?
The burial chambers shift. Instead of vertical pits, you start getting horizontal passage tombs, yukuwana, shikiseki shitsu, like a corridor leading into a stone room built into the side of the mound. Easier access, maybe for later burials.
Interesting. And the grave goods changed too.
They did. You still find mirrors and jewels, but now you see a lot more practical or maybe military items. Horse trappings, bits, saddles, stirrups, and lots of iron weapons and armor.
Horse trappings and weapons. So maybe that reflects that shift in the ruler's role you mentioned. Less priestly, more warrior king.
That's a strong possibility, yeah. The horse gear is particularly interesting because it suggests mounted warfare becoming important, something likely learned from the continent. It points to a more military character for the leadership.
Let's just dwell on the scale for a moment. The Daisenri Kofun. Can you give us a sense of the effort involved?
It's honestly staggering. Estimates suggest it took maybe 15 years to build, with thousands of workers moving millions of cubic meters of earth every single day.
Thousands of people for 15 years.
Just think about the organization required, feeding them, housing them, directing the work. It tells you the Yamato rulers by this time commanded immense resources and authority, real state-level power.
Was it just brute force? Or was there planning involved?
Oh, definitely planning. Recent studies show there were actually standardized designs, like fixed proportions between the round part and the square part of the keyhole shape. Sophisticated surveying must have been involved.
And the moats? Were they just ditches?
Not just ditches, they were also where they got a lot of the earth to build the mound itself. Dig the moat, pile up the earth.
Clever. Efficient.
And some researchers even think the water level in the moats might have been used as a reference point, like a giant spirit level, to help shape the mound accurately.
That's really smart. What about other notable Kofun? You mentioned Goshikizuka.
Yes, the Goshikizuka Kofun in Kobe. It's not as enormous as Daisenri, but still very large, almost 200 meters long, and it's beautifully situated facing the Seto Inland Sea.
And the name means five-colored mound.
Right, because its slopes were originally covered in these colorful stones, the fukishishi, different shades, pebbles to larger rocks. It must have looked incredible.
So not covered in trees like we see today.
You know, that's a later thing, when they were neglected. Originally, you'd see the stone-covered slopes, the clear keyhole shape, and rows of Haniwa figures standing on the top and terraces. Very different, very imposing.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. What was happening elsewhere in East Asia around this time, say the 4th century? How did that affect Japan?
It was a really dynamic and often turbulent time on the continent. In China, the Jin dynasty had lost the north and retreated south.
Okay.
On the Korean peninsula, the state of Goguryeo in the north was expanding its power. It conquered the last Chinese commandery, Leilang.
Right. And in the south.
The southern part of Korea was also consolidating. You see the kingdoms of Baekje and Silla becoming more powerful, emerging from earlier tribal confederations. And then there was the Gaya Confederacy, a collection of smaller states in the far south.
And Japan, or Wa as it was called then, got involved.
Very much so. It seems the Yamato rulers used the Gaia region, those smaller states, as a kind of foothold or base for interacting with the peninsula.
What were their goals?
It looks like they allied with Baekje, partly to gain access to resources and continental knowledge, but also to exert influence over Silla, and importantly, to counter the expansion of Goguryeo from the north.
So alliances and rivalries. Was there actual fighting?
Oh, yes. We have evidence for significant conflict, especially between Wa forces and Goguryeo, starting from the late 4th century.
What evidence is that?
The most famous piece is the inscription on a massive stone stele erected in honor of King Wangaido of Goguryeo. He was a great conqueror.
The Guangado still. What does it say?
Well, it celebrates his victories. And crucially, it mentions that Wa forces had crossed the sea and were active in the peninsula from the year 391. It talks about battles where Goguryeo fought against Wa and Baekje forces.
So direct evidence of Japanese military involvement in Korea in the late 4th, early 5th century.
Exactly. It's a hugely important historical source, even though it's obviously from the Goguryeo perspective.
Now, sometimes you hear about Mimana and a Japanese outpost there. What's the story with that?
Ah, right. The term Mimana, or sometimes Imna, appears in later Japanese chronicles, like the Nihon Shoki from the 8th century. And these texts talk about a supposed Japanese administrative office there, the Mimana Nihonfu.
A Japanese government general in Korea.
That's the traditional idea based on those later texts. However, there are issues. The term Imna itself is rare in Korean sources of the time. And critically, there's no real archaeological or contemporary textual evidence from Korea or China that supports the existence of an actual Japanese governing body called the Nihonfu in the Gaia region.
So the historical consensus has shifted.
Yes. Most historians today use the term Gaia for that region and view the relationship as more complex, involving alliances, trade, conflict, maybe Japanese settlers or mercenaries, but not direct colonial rule through a Nihonfu in the way it was once imagined. The Gwanggaedo stele suggests conflict and intervention, but not necessarily administration.
Okay, that makes sense. It's important to distinguish between later accounts and contemporary evidence.
Definitely. And there used to be controversies about the Gwanggaedo stele inscription itself, like theories it was deliberately altered, but those have been largely discredited now. It's generally accepted as a genuine 5th century record.
So moving into the 5th century, we also hear about the 5 kings of Wa sending envoys to China.
Who were they?
These were 5 rulers. Their names are given phonetic Chinese renderings: San, Qin, Sei, Ke, and Bu, who sent missions to the Southern Song Dynasty court in China. They are generally identified as Yamato Great Kings.
And why were they sending envoys all the way to China?
Primarily, it seems, to get recognition from the Chinese emperor. This was a way to bolster their legitimacy. How so?
By getting the emperor to grant them titles, especially titles that acknowledge their authority not just within Wa Japan, but also their military influence over parts of southern Korea like Baekje, Silla, and Gaia. It was about international prestige and solidifying their position in the East Asian world order.
So diplomacy as a tool of power projection.
Exactly. And we think we can actually identify the last of these kings, King Bu.
Oh, who is he thought to be?
He's widely believed to be the ruler known in the Japanese chronicles as Emperor Yuraku. His personal name seems to have been Wakatakaru.
Wakatakaru, that name sounds important.
It is, because King Bu, or Yuryaku Wakatakaru, sent a memorial to the Chinese emperor around 478 CE, and in it he basically boasts about how his ancestors and he himself conquered various peoples across Japan, east, west, and north, and also campaigned overseas.
So his own words, via the Chinese records, paint a picture of a consolidating expansionist ruler.
Precisely. It suggests the Yamato king himself was actively involved in military campaigns, both subduing rivals within Japan and fighting on the peninsula. Though it's worth noting that by the later 5th century, Wa's influence in Korea seems to be declining, probably due to Goguryeo continued strength.
And that name, Wakatakaru, connects to another amazing discovery, doesn't it? The inscribed swords.
Yes, absolutely. This is where archaeology provides stunning confirmation. The discovery of an iron sword in the Inariyama Kofun, which is way up in Saitama Prefecture near modern Tokyo.
Quite far from Yamato.
Very far. And using x-rays, they found a long inscription, 115 characters, inlaid in gold or silver.
Incredible. What did it say?
It names the person buried, an official who served someone named Wakakeru Ikimi, and crucially, it gives a date, the Shinhai year.
Wakapir, the same name as King Bu Emperor Yuryaku.
Exactly, and based on that identification, the Shinhai year can be calculated as 471 CE.
Wow. So a dated inscription, naming the king, found in a tomb hundreds of miles from the Yamato heartland.
It's monumental. It provided a solid date and confirmed the name Wakatakeru was in use for a great king in the 5th century.
Did this help with other finds?
It unlocked another mystery. There was another inscribed sword found much earlier, back in the 19th century, in the Etsunayama Kofun in Kumamoto, Kyushu.
Way down south.
Right. The inscription was damaged, and people couldn't agree on how to read the king's name. But after the Inariyama discovery, it became clear that the name on the Etsunayama sword could also be read as Wakatakeru.
So the same king mentioned on swords, buried with powerful local figures in both eastern Japan and Kyushu.
Yes. It's powerful evidence for the reach of the Yamato kingship in the 5th century. It shows that powerful regional clans, far from the center, acknowledge the authority of the Wakatakeru king. These swords are like direct messages from that era.
Amazing finds. Okay, one last major topic for this period. The movement of people from the continent.
Yes, this was hugely important. All this interaction, diplomacy, trade, warfare inevitably led to people migrating from the Korean Peninsula and China to Japan.
Why were they coming?
Various reasons. Some were probably refugees, fleeing war or instability on the mainland. But the Yamato rulers also seem to have actively welcomed and even recruited people with valuable skills.
What kind of skills?
We know that by the 5th century, groups of weavers, ayabito, and scribes, fuhido, had arrived. Writing was obviously crucial for administration.
Right, literacy.
Then, especially from the late 5th century onwards, there seems to have been a larger influx, particularly from Bakshe, which was under pressure from Goguryeo. These people brought all sorts of advanced knowledge.
Like what?
Oh, metalworking, making better tools and weapons, sophisticated pottery techniques like sewware, advanced weaving, civil engineering for large construction projects, maybe even irrigation, and administrative skills, writing, record-keeping, finance, animal husbandry, too.
So they contributed across the board to the development of the Yamato state.
Massively. The Yamato court called these immigrants kikajin, which translates sort of like naturalized people.
Is it an accurate term?
Well, it reflects the court's perspective, maybe influenced by Chinese ideas about barbarians being drawn to civilization. But it doesn't capture the whole picture. Not all came voluntarily, perhaps. Some scholars prefer Toraijin, just people who came from overseas.
But Kikajin implies they settled and became part of society.
Yes, and that's important. Toraijin doesn't quite convey that integration. These weren't just visitors. They settled, formed communities, often grouped by their skills, and became integral parts of Yamato society, especially around the Kinai region, the Yamato heartland.
Could we see their influence in later clan structures?
Absolutely. You see the formation of powerful clans, often designated as fuhito scribes, or associated with specific crafts, like the Aya clan, linked to weaving, or the Kawachi no Fuhito and Takechi no Fuhito, groups heavily involved in administration. Their contribution was fundamental to building the Yamato state. So wrapping this up, we've journeyed from the twilight of Yamatai through the rise of the impressive Kofun culture.
Seeing how those keyhole tombs evolved and spread, reflecting the growing power of the Yamato polity.
Right. And we looked at how Yamato interacted with the complex world of the Korean peninsula, using clues from Chinese records, the Gwanggaru stele, and the missions of the 5 kings of Wa.
And those incredible inscribed swords giving us a direct link to King Wakatakeru in the 5th century.
Exactly. And finally, the crucial role played by the Kikajin, the immigrants who brought so much knowledge and skill from the continent.
It's such a formative period. You see internal developments like the tomb styles and consolidation of power, but also constant interaction and influence from outside.
Definitely. Which leads to a good question for you, the listener, to ponder. Considering everything we've discussed, the internal growth shown by things like the Kofun and the swords, and the clear external influences from Korea and China, how would you weigh those factors? What do you think were the main drivers of change in Japan during these centuries?
And what questions still linger for you about this era? It's a time with many answers still buried, perhaps literally. Maybe this discussion encourages you to look deeper into the archaeology or the translated text yourself.